going to go over a game in honor of Mark Taimanov. Now, you may remember that Mark Taimanov played a match against Fischer, and at the time he was considered one of the world's top players, and yet Fischer beat him 6-0. But that was in the early 70s, and here we're going to look at a game that Mark Taimanov played back in 1954, which some might consider more that was more interesting. He won a tournament in Leningrad in 1954, and he's playing a variation which at the time was considered popular. He's playing black here with the Sicilian, and he's playing an opponent by the name of Vladimirovich Scherbakov. And here, the Sicilian has normally starts, white plays e4, black plays c5, and white chooses to play knight f3, black plays knight c6, and it was much more popular at the time to play the d6 line, but Taimanov had been practicing this variation at the time, and so white plays d4, black takes, white takes, and black plays knight f6. Now, this also brings up a few issues. Now, first of all, if you're playing the Sicilian, normally white is playing for playing in the center and on the king side, and here already the d file is open. You can see that with these, even with these first few moves, that white is already in a position where his bishops have a full capability. There are open lines for them. The knight is ready to come in. White has a freer game. Black, on the other hand, usually plays for the queen side and sometimes less often in the center, and even less often on the king side, even though there's more and more games today where black is attacking on the king side and some variations, especially the e5 lines. But here, as long as this diagonal is open, white can't make any plans to play an early e5. For example, white can't play like knight takes knight, expecting that, well, if black plays this, maybe I'll trade queens with him, play bishop here, stop the king from getting to a comfortable square, or playing knight c3 and then bishop there and castling first and guarding the pawn first, or knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and I'll just push e5. But as soon as you push e5, you present this weakness. It's undefended. It's even closer to black's camp, and it's within firing range because this diagonal is open. Black can just play check and pick the pawn up. So white plays knight c3, and black plays the d6 variation. I prefer e6 these days, but there's nothing wrong with d6. Taimanov is known for starting off with pretty solid opening variations, opening lines. And here white plays bishop g5. And the bishop g5 has been much more popular in the past than it is today. Even though white still plays queen d2 and f4 and something similar to what you're going to see in this game. Black plays the e6 variation. Black's idea is, I'm not going to let you take the pawn and double, even though taking back on the pawn does offer you a little bit of play at the cost of some weakening of the king side. You have a play on the G file. You have a little bit better control of the center. White can't play for f4 and e5 easily. So black prefers this more solid line, and white plays queen d3. Now, if white plays queen d2, one of the tactical shots he has to watch out for is bishop e7 with the threat of knight takes, and on that bishop. Sometimes that's okay because you can respond by taking there, and when the knight takes back from this, you take there and you take the pawn after the bishops exchange. But here, white plays what was popular at the time, the queen d3 line. So he's not going to allow for any shots here after bishop b7 and knight takes. He's going to protect the center, and of course, once that queen's out of the way, he's getting ready for queenside castling. Black plays a6. So notice that once after white's castled, one place he has a little bit better pressure on is on the d file. The queen and rook, and possibly knight b5 is threatened. And also notice that not only does this take away b5 for the knight, but it also prepares at some point for black to possibly exchange and play b5 himself and possibly apply a little bit of pressure to the queen side. Okay? So here white plays castles queen side, and black plays bishop d7. Okay? Once again, a much more popular line in the 50s and 60s and 70s than it is nowadays. And you would think that black would just play bishop b7, but notice how the bishop is guarding this pawn. And if you play bishop b7 then, and he takes, you're committed to taking with, you may be committed in some positions to taking with the pawn rather than the bishop, because you may be worried about that d6 pawn. And so black plays bishop d7 instead and delays that decision and waits for white to decide how he's going to play the position. White in this game plays f4. Now what happens here is also mirrored in the Petrov's defense and a couple of variations of that. And what has become popular against some of the f4 lines in other variations in the Sicilian as well, there is this idea that black has where he says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and expand on the king side, and I'm going to do this in trying to get control of e5 a little bit better, if I can get you to trade pawns, as you'll see in just a moment. And white normally doesn't want to take the knight and give up that nice bishop that he's invested in developing. He normally wants to pull it back. However, even at the time, they were already experimenting with the g5 idea. And the idea is that if white takes, then black can move this knight somewhere, and this pawn's pinned. And black can recover it, take the pawn later, open up the h-file, and black gets some play, unexpected play on the king side, and he induces white to give up control of this square, give up control of the e5 square, which may be used by the knight. And white is normally not interested in taking the knight because that activates the bishop, and black's play is a little bit easier in that case after, especially as you may commonly know, in exchanging a piece or two in the Sicilian. And white chooses to take the pawn, and Grandmaster Taimanov decides on knight g4. Okay, so he's playing knight g4, he's hitting this square, and notice how the bishop can't really do both. The bishop has to watch this square at the moment. The bishop's trying to watch this square at the moment. This pawn can't push or take because of queen takes bishop. So now you kind of see the idea of why black played for this, played for g5. And so what white decides to do is he decides, I'm going to prevent you from getting any play on f2. I'm just going to play my queen over here to g3. And if you want to go in and take this stuff, fine. I'm going to get your knight. I'm going to not leave you with any, perhaps you might say, opening preparation. But this turns out to be a bit dangerous, okay? Black decides, well, it's okay. I'll go ahead and take the pawn, okay? And if you want to take my knight, for example, I could take back with a rook. I can keep this h-file open. I can make trouble for you. But white realizes that, well, if you take my bishop, again, I can take the knight, but I don't want you to take with the rook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try for a trick. I'm going to play my knight here. I'm going to prevent you from taking with your rook. And if you take with the pawn and you close off your own file, I'll just play queen takes knight on mine fine. But here's where I'd like you guys to look here and see if you see any tactics. Okay, so here, black is, of course, threatening to take the bishop. White's going to take the knight in response. And white chooses, once again, this move, knight f3, to prevent the rook from taking on h4. Okay, but there's a tactic here. When you play positions like this, you're expecting certain tactics. You need to follow the tactics all the way through and make sure that you're okay at the end of the variation. So here, for example, White's idea was to prevent the rook from taking here and keeping this file open. And if he takes there with the pawn, once again, he closes his own file. I'll play queen takes knight, and I'll be fine. But I want you guys to go a step beyond that. What could happen if black takes with the pawn, white takes with the knight? What can black do? What kind of threats can black create?
Play e5.
I want to hear from you guys. Okay, play for e5. So e5 would do what? e5 would
attack the queen.
Hit the queen. Where can the queen go after that? So let's follow through with that threat. So queen takes knight, pawn takes bishop, queen takes knight, e5. We're threatening the queen. Where can the queen go? Can you see any issues here? Can the queen go back? Okay, is the queen safe? Can it find a way back?
What, you mean
No.
it can't go to e2?
Well, if the queen's here, okay, he takes there, we take here. Can the queen go back there? Yeah.
Still on the fourth path?
Yeah.
I'm not good with visualizations yet.
Right. So here, pawn takes bishop, queen takes knight. He plays e5. The queen can't return, can it?
Oh, is it trapped?
Yeah. Well, what do you think? I don't know. You tell me. Okay. I've looked at this, so I want you to give me some suggestions. Okay. So pawn takes, queen takes, e5, threatening the queen. Now notice that pawn prevents the queen from comfortably returning. Where can the white queen go after that? Well, no, he's got one square.
F4?
One square he can go to. Well, if the pawn goes here, can he go to f4?
Oh, no.
Okay, no. Okay, so once again, pawn takes, queen takes, e5. We're hitting the queen. Okay.
It has to get off the diagonal then.
Yeah, it has to move off the diagonal. Okay, unless we could pin the bishop somehow, which I don't think that that's possible. So the queen, or threaten something of equal value, we could threaten like black's queen with something. I don't see any of that being so possible with the black queen so far away. But where can the queen go? The one square the queen can go to try to save itself. G5. G5. What do you guys think? Pawn takes bishop, queen takes knight, e5, queen to g5.
No.
Why isn't that okay?
Queen takes queen.
Queen takes queen.
Queen takes queen. I want you to look at it longer.
Oh, then the knight takes the queen.
Okay. Yeah, the knight can take it. The knight's guarding it. Look further. Actually, not much further. Okay, so pawn takes bishop, queen takes knight, e5, queen to g5. There's a problem with all that.
Well, I'm just telling you, the king on c1 and that diagonal with the queen, I'm just worried about a king check. That's what I'm worried about.
Okay. So he's suggesting that maybe you've perhaps seen variations where there can be a problem with the queen and the king being lined up, or a check in the diagonal, perhaps. Okay. So pawn takes, queen takes, e5. This pawn is now here. You guys do that when you're looking ahead. The pawn is not there anymore. It's now here. This is gone. White's taking the knight, so this is gone. Okay. White's queen's here. Black pawn's here. We play e5, hitting the queen. Now the queen is up to g5. And so he's saying, I'm worried because the queen's on the same diagonal as the king. What does that suggest that black could try?
Bishop h6.
Bishop h6. What do you guys think? I have a bishop. So, pawn takes, queen takes, e5. The only square left is g5. But that puts the queen and king on the same diagonal as the king. And what?
Absolute pin.
Bishop to h6.
Absolute pin.
And he resigns.